Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And a splendid evening to you. This is Newsline Live. As Ukraine enters a very troubled mode, us here in Sri Lanka know quite a bit about that sort of thing. After all, we had 30 plus years of terrible time in which our economy suffered, the people's trust deficit increased, and so on and so forth. In times of war and so on, especially when we think back in Sri Lanka about the 33 plus years that we had, I think it's nice once in a way to remember the sheer patriotism and dedicated service given to this country by thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who served in the armed forces, in the military, and of course Sri Lanka's police as well. And there's one person amongst many but today I've just realized that out of 60 years he spent 39 years serving Sri Lanka's Navy. And so I'd like to say very happy birthday to retired Admiral Ravi Wijegunratne. My guest this evening to discuss the matters in eastern Ukraine is, of course, somebody who knows a thing or two about this subject of international relations. It's Dr. Harinda Vidanage, who is, of course, the head of Department Strategic Studies at the Kotalawala Defence University, better known sometimes as KDU. Very good evening to you, Dr. Harinda Vidanage.
Good evening, Faraz.
And thank you for being on the program. Now then, is it fair to say that Russia is flexing its muscles over eastern Ukraine?
It's very fair to say that, Faraz, Russia has been doing that for some time now, and with very good reasons, very valid reasons. And I think the Russians have been very wary about three things in the last 20 years. That is since the fall of the Soviet Union, and they have been very worried about the EU expansion, the European Union expanding.
The EU expansion.
Number two, the NATO expansion. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the foremost formidable defense security alliance established during the Cold War, led by the Americans, has expanded several times, 1999, 2004. And the last expansion wanted to get Ukraine as part of the alliance. So this actually probably is the closest reason why the Russians are very unhappy.
Yeah, because obviously it's been clear that the Russians have wanted a sort of buffer between themselves and the West and NATO.
Yeah, and number three, of course, is something a bit of a thorny issue, but it's called, in simple terms, democracy promotion.
Right.
Democracy promotion has been used predominantly by the geopolitical West, sometimes with good intentions, but it is always mixed with geopolitical interests. So that sometimes becomes a very toxic mix when you try to promote democracy, expand a security alliance, expand a trade, a larger supranational alliance. So, being a great power as Russia is, I mean, when you have three things encircling you and encroaching on your territorial boundaries, and especially great powers have special security interests, you feel very insecure. So I think this is one of the major reasons why Russia has been consistently arguing that, tone it down. So I think it has come to a point where the Russians are now responding in kind, and now you see a major build-up happening. But of course there are other complications. The times are very different from what it was 20 years ago. There are other interests, Russian interests as well as interests from other countries such as China. So this has complicated the situation further than when it was in the late 90s.
Thank you very much for your questions. And of course you can send your questions by SMS or WhatsApp to 0772 300 305, comes right here. Not all questions are taken, but you know, some are. And I like this one here. When a monkey at the wheel messes around with geopolitical balance, ultimately the people of a sovereign nation suffer. Do you sort of comment on that?
Well, leadership, of course, counts, whatever the decisions you make. But I think it's not as simplistic as that. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is a series of complex phenomena coming into play. So it's not Putin, it's not just Biden, but I think it's when a country's security interests are challenged, and of course the Europeans also have had their issues. This is, I think, the Russians are flexing their muscle at a very strategically advantageous time for the Russians, as they think. Because the key proponents in the European power dynamic, Germany, France, Britain, they're not in total, sync.
They're all singing different
and they all have three different major challenges. The Germans have a serious energy crisis. The German nuclear power program, civil nuclear program, aligning with American interests, started toning down. So they shut down their civil nuclear energy generation. So 50% of their energy is pretty much dependent on the supplies that come from Russia. So, and for France, they are in the middle of a presidential kind of election. They are gearing up for that, and of course Britain has a Boris Johnson problem. So they're all in three different. So I think the Russians thought this was the most advantageous moment to kind of build it up and to kind of deter any sort of NATO expansion or aggression they thought that the West is going to bring upon them. And I think to a certain extent that has aggravated this issue.
And thank you very much for all the questions that's coming in from our viewers. We have some questions from Texas in the United States. We have some from East London to South London. And thank you. We appreciate your interest. We appreciate your support of our program. And of course, we value immensely your critique. Now then, the British Prime Minister today announced some sanctions. He called this the first tranche. 5 banks, Russian banks, have been put on hold, and also 3 businessmen. But it's interesting to note that none of these, of the 3 business people, none of these so-called Russian oligarchs have been named. But won't sanctions fuel tensions? Yeah,
I think the West has always preferred sanctions in the last, if you look at the 10-20 years, sanctions has been the most preferred use of influence by the West. Which which they see is second to military intervention or military aggression. And more than the British Prime Minister, I think one of the most strongest messages came a couple of days back from American Vice President Kamala Harris when she was addressing the Munich Security Conference, and they said they are going to bring down the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed by the Americans on Russia if an invasion takes place, which, if you kind of break that down, one of the biggest challenges Russia would face is if the SWIFT system is...
Indeed, there was some suggestion that they would do that.
Yeah, if they do it, because the Russian economy is not as diversified as many other economies, economies of strong power. So they do have very much of a concentrated economy. So one of the major areas is energy supplies, probably sales of the armament industry and some kind of chemicals. But I think the sanctions can hurt the Russians. So this is a conflict which I see would not benefit anybody if it erupts.
If it erupts.
This is what we call the no war, no peace situation, which probably would last for some time.
Do you think that, because we mentioned the SWIFT system of transferring money, the banking system, do you think that this will now result in the older and the manual method of funds being downloaded? I think it's called the SPP system, which would then bypasses the SWIFT system.
Yeah, of course, I think there has to be, there have been countries which have worked around sanctions. Iran is a classic example. They still use certain bartering and trading, gold trading, gold for oil and all these things. But when you are unplugged from the mainstream, it would always create challenges. So, and of course that will create reciprocal issues as well, because most of Europe is very dependent on energy supplies that's coming from Russia. I don't know if the people are aware that few months back the energy prices in Northern Europe has gone through sky high. We are talking about Sri Lanka's energy crisis and the pricing. But if somebody breaks down the Spanish energy markets, the prices have gone up by 600%. So Europe is already reeling from an ongoing crunch. Imagine what this would add. So I don't think anybody would benefit from this. Even the sanctions would again reciprocally hurt Europe. So I don't think this is a war that anybody wants to really to break out.
Of course, Germany have now put on hold the pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, and that must be a severe blow to Russia as well.
Yeah, but I don't know how long you can maintain that, because the Nord Stream 2, I mean, of course, it directly connects the two countries.
Yeah.
So I don't know for how long Germany can also afford not to get that, because I think, as I said, Germany is very reliant on the energy that is coming from supplies coming from Russia. So there has been talk about alternative negotiations with other energy companies, American companies, and Americans have brokered these talks. But I think the amount, the volume that the Germans need, I don't think any other company has the assets, the infrastructure to provide that to Germany. So of course this can be used as leverage for short term, but I don't think anybody can do a total cut of Russian energy supplies into Europe. So that's why I'm saying, both there is a significant interdependency between Russia and Europe, especially for Putin. It's very important he does not totally break down relations with France and Germany, because there is so much of interdependence on business, on the economy between the three countries. Of course, you can afford to have problems with other European countries, but not the big two. So I don't foresee this dragging. I mean, if even the Germans can continue, because Nord Stream 2 would benefit Germany as well as Russia.
Yes, but I mean, the German allies, especially the Americans, Britain, so on, they've been pushing for this for a while now.
They have been, but I think, of course, the Americans have. It's been very clear that, I think, coming even from the U.S. president down, they have been very wary about Nord Stream 2. But the thing is, there is no alternative. There is no way you can substitute what Nord Stream 2 is bringing in that scale. So the challenge, and the other challenge for Russia is also, Ukraine is, I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about the whole invasion thing. Ukraine is quite big. I mean, and Russia has a significant military, but it's not totally strong on the infantry side. I mean, I don't think you can have enough soldiers to hold. And I think the Russians also were going for a strategy to kind of put extreme pressure using the winter and the energy supplies. Winter is great, but coming spring, the spring is coming. The Russia they have moved all their heavy armor. Heavy armor and spring after winter is a really bad combination. And the Americans and the Brits have been supplying the Ukrainians with a lot of anti-tank, anti-armor munitions. So that's, if you look at that equation, tanks won't move fast. It's soggy, it's muddy. They are sitting ducks at some point. So strategically also, I don't see this going for, if the Russians also can maintain this for a long time.
But it also
I mean fully blown conflict.
Indeed, but it also shows that such events help sustain the very large American defense industry.
Of course.
So it's at the end of the day, whichever way you look at it, one perspective is always financial.
Oh yeah, just between I think late 90s and 2013, $5 billion worth of military assets have been moved. They're traded. to Ukraine by the Americans, and they keep on, and they are even now giving what you call weapons for lease. Like they have brought in a lot of new anti-missile systems. So that's all money. So of course it's also big business.
Indeed, it's a pity that they didn't do stuff like that when Sri Lanka was going through its 30 years of annus horribilis. Anyway, on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a peek at this evening's headline news, where I'm sure you'll find even more coverage of the Ukraine crisis. But let's take a peek, shall we? We'll see you on the back side of this break.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
Valuable Finance, best finance company.
TV1 රැස්වීදෙන ජීවිතේ.
Surcharge tax bill tabled in Parliament without amendments.
125ක් ටැක්ස් කරනවා කියන එක ආණ්ඩුව කිව්වා මේක අපි ඉවත් කරගන්නවා කියලා. නමුත් මේ පනත එහෙම ඉවත් කරලා නැහැ.
Hidden details on the Central Expressway revealed.
කවුද නිල්චාඩ් වික්‍රමසිංහ කියන්නේ? හරියට අර බබාවකුම් පාත් වගේ.
Sensitive reports on April 21st attacks tabled in Parliament. Power cuts to be imposed in stages. Fuel crisis intensifies in the country. Attorney General says Minister Gammanpilla has moved court over Keduvalapitiya power plant deal. Who is destroying maize cultivations in Riddhi Maliyadda?
TV1 රැස්වීදෙන ජීවිතේ.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with Dr.Harinda Vidanage, who is of course the head of Department Strategic Studies at KDU, the Kotalavla Defence University. Now then, many questions from our public, sovereign people of this country. How does this situation impact our country, especially when we ourselves are having such a significant issue in terms of our energy security?
Yeah, I think it's affecting energy security of many countries, and it's actually creating a major destabilizing ripple across the world. And if you just take Sri Lanka alone, we are actually in the middle of an energy crisis, and the government has declared that. But if you looked at the price of the barrel of oil in the last, say, 2 weeks, right, the way it was skyrocketing, right, it has a direct correlation with what's happening in Ukraine. And to make things worse, as I said, the energy crisis which is hitting Europe, the Europeans are looking for alternatives. The Europeans are looking for, they are sourcing energy supplies from non-traditional markets that they are not used to. So they are coming to UAE, they are coming to Qatar. So what's happening is we have been trading, we have been sourcing oil supplies, petroleum supplies from those countries. So what's happening is the higher demand from our traditional buyers, it's inflating the prices further. So of course it's having a major effect on Sri Lanka. So this is why I think sometimes people will think, why are we talking about Ukraine? Why are we talking about a major crisis in the world?
I think the last time the people in Sri Lanka would have really looked at Ukraine was to do with the MiG affair. Well, because then almost daily we had the press and so on talking about Ukraine March and all that business. So
yeah, that's a different context. But I think now what we should realize is any major conflict in the world, especially conflict which has serious energy sensitivities, will have a major impact on countries like Sri Lanka, though we are very far away from the epicenter of that crisis. We are still being hit.
And whilst we were on that subject, just like to remind our people that not long ago, Sri Lanka's FCID, in its investigations of that particular transaction, did have cause to visit one part of Ukraine, Lugan, because that was supposed to be a place where it was rather lawless and without any kind of sensible rules at play. So Lugan certainly has featured for Sri Lanka, at least in terms of investigations carried out by that police department. Now then, Dr. Vidanage, tell me, let's go on about this, the use of sanctions. Will it work?
Sanctions always had certain impact, but it is very much limited, very narrow. It doesn't, I mean, of course you have sustained sanctions on countries like North Korea. You have sustained sanctions on regimes such as the junta in Cambodia, in Burma. And then of course there are targeted sanctions now also on Chinese businesses, Chinese individuals. So it has a limited effect, but I don't think it can destabilize. It can, it's not going to deter the Russians, the sanctions. But the Russians also have to be wary about what comes after. But for me, more than sanctions, I think we should look at this idea of an invasion. People are dramatizing it, sensationalizing it, but now I'll give you another perspective of the energy security. Ukraine has 15 nuclear power stations.
Okay.
15.
Right.
But that's a huge amount.
Of course it is.
50% of Ukrainian energy is nuclear generated. So you think a major war, imagine one nuclear station being hit.
That would be...
That's nuclear, that's a new, and the nuclear, the clouds will directly go to Russia.
And so therefore, that itself is the emergency handbrake.
Oh yes. So what I'm saying is there are so many sides we don't. Well, we are seeing the daily news, the news items that's coming from the build-up and all. Yeah, the build-ups are there. Build-ups have always been there, but if you are looking at it through diverse perspectives, one, nobody wants to sustain a war in Ukraine. I don't think the Russians even can afford it. I don't think the West can afford it. The NATO is very ill-equipped and ill-prepared to sustain a war as well.
But despite the billions of dollars that the Americans spend on their security.
But the Americans also, you forget Biden is new. Donald Trump administration has been destabilizing NATO ever since. He was not a big friend of NATO. He has been demanding NATO countries to pay their share.
Yes.
And NATO, the alliance was somewhat not in great shape.
Bless Mr. Trump. I mean, he looked at all this from a commercial angle.
Yes, and most European countries have not modernized their militaries as we would anybody would have imagined. So I think, and if you look at if you look at the military balance, the Russians still have a huge tilt. I mean, just understand, Russia has a $45 billion GDP of defense spending, and 4 billion by the Ukrainians. So it's a stark mismatch. But that doesn't mean a war can be sustained by either parties.
But if you look at it from Mr. Putin's perspective, all he wanted was to maintain a buffer between NATO and himself.
I think the Russians have Russia. To be fair to Vladimir Putin, I'm not trying to defend. But what his point has always been is that there is something called Russian security interests.
Absolutely.
And the West have consistently ignored that. And actually have, and as I said from at the beginning, expanding EU, expanding NATO.
We could also argue that the West has consistently ignored the security interests of the people of Palestine as well.
Yeah, I mean the security, you know, in academia we call it securitization. So you construct your own referent objective of who is to be securitized and not. So of course it's a privileged position. So sometimes people, countries, people, entities which are in positions of privilege can always decide who to secure and who not to, who to securitize and who not to. That's academic discussion.
Yes.
But coming back to Russia and Ukraine, of course, I think Russia has a lot of fair reasons why they are very much, but and the West should not underestimate Russia, but I also think the Russians also should not overstretch themselves. The Russian military has certain capabilities, but it's not the one in best shape. It's still very short. There is huge shortage of manpower, and they can't afford to. It's not going to be outright win. Even geopolitically or geographically, the terrain would not help them. If they're going to overrun Ukraine, they have to do it from east to west.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
Right.
And that will bog them down in a long, entrenched guerrilla or some kind of a entrenched conflict that will not help the Russians at all.
And the Russian presence is in eastern Ukraine is being described as a peacekeeping mission. Is that a nice euphemism for another word for an invasion?
No. This is just after, I think, Luhansk and Donetsk declared independence, and the Russians accepted that. So these are the two breakaway regions which are more Russian-speaking, more aligned to Russia. So what Putin has done, I think, is a masterstroke. So he has sent a force in, which is not. It is not invasion. It's a kind of a See, one thing that the West fear about Putin is the master strategist, and he's a great political warfare strategist. His form of political warfare has undermined many Western experts and Western strategies. So I think this is part of it, but it also, the downside is the moment the Russians start sending in troops still into parts of sovereign Ukraine, and the rest of the world sees that as a sovereign Ukraine, that undermines the diplomatic efforts to curtail this problem. So that those two can be immediate flashpoints. But I think what Putin is trying to do is avoiding the invasion, but he's making sure Russian military presence will be in Ukraine for a while.
And what chances of invasion? 15 nuclear power stations notwithstanding.
No, I don't. I mean, the thing is, you can invade a country if there is zero resistance. But the Ukrainians are also well armed. Since 2014, since the first the takeover of Crimea, what the Americans and the West have done is they have systematically built up trained Ukrainian soldiers, assets build up. So Ukraine has a sophisticated military capability. It's very different from what they were in 2014. So it's not going to be a walk in the park for the Russians as well. So I don't think so. I think what Putin has done is played a masterstroke by making these two regions declare themselves as independent and send in troops because now, and they call themselves peacekeepers. So that's art of political warfare at its best.
I don't know whether you can manage to say this in a minute or give us an answer. Why did the West not foresee through intelligence the Russian intentions? What have you got to say?
I think the West saw it coming. But I think it's all, it's geopolitically, it's also advances Western interests as well. This is a reason for Americans to strengthen the NATO alliance. This is a reason for the tattered European, the leadership to come together. So in a way, creating a common anti-Russia front is good for the West. It's good for American leadership because they finally can bring the West back into the fold, because otherwise they were running on. So if you look at it in geostrategic terms, sometimes adversaries' behavior is encouraged because you can also build up certain political advantages. America was not leading, but now Americans have got again the chance to lead, and the NATO to strengthen. So and also and the West has a lot to lose if they lose as well, because this will advance China's interests in geopolitics. So the Americans probably, sometimes it's like the war, the Gulf War. The Americans actually encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait.
Indeed, yeah.
And then they brought all hell down on Iraq. People should never forget that.
They should indeed. Dr. Harinda Vidanage, thank you for reminding us about that, and thank you very much for being on Newsline
Thank you
Live.
for having me, Faraz.
And it's a great pleasure, and that's the way it was on Newsline Live this wonderful day, 22/2/22. What a date. And on that note, it's time to say thank you, good night, and as always, God bless you.